My father was the quietest man I've ever known. He wasn't cold, not distant exactly. He tucked me in at night. He made pancakes on Saturdays. He fixed the screen door without being asked. But he moved through the world like a man half listening to something only he could hear, something buried far beneath the sounds the rest of us lived in. We grew up in a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. Vinyl siding, squeaky floorboards, a porch swing that groaned under weight and memory. My father built that swing with his own hands. He rarely sat on it, but sometimes I'd catch him out there in the early mornings before work, coffee in hand, just staring at the trees. There were photos of him in uniform, tucked inside an old album on the top shelf of the hall closet. I wasn't supposed to touch it, but I did, more than once. In those black and white images, he looked impossibly young, standing with other soldiers, all of them squinting into the sun, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders as if they were just boys on a camping trip. But my father never spoke of the war. Not when I asked about the medals hidden in his desk drawer, not when we had to memorize the Pledge of Allegiance in school. Not even on Veterans Day, when our small town would hold a parade and people would clap as men like him walked past. He never joined those parades, never wore the old jacket, never stood when they played the anthem. He would simply sip his coffee, nod politely, and say nothing. As a kid, I didn't understand. I thought maybe he was embarrassed, or maybe the memories were gone, left behind with the boots and the uniform and the shrapnel scar on his shoulder. A scar he never explained, even when I asked. Just a scratch, he'd say, from a long time ago. And that was that. I remember once, maybe I was 12, I pushed a little harder. We were in the garage, him working on the car, me handing him tools. I asked, "Dad, what was it like being in the war?" He froze, just for a moment. Then he reached for the wrench and said, "War is nothing to talk about." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even stern. It was final. After that, I stopped asking. My mother never said much either. She was softer than him, warmer in her way. She'd glance at him sometimes when certain news reports came on, stories from overseas, scenes of soldiers in dusty terrain. Her hand would find his on the armrest, and he'd pull away gently, like it burned. At night, I'd hear him sometimes, low murmurs, gasping. Once he shouted something in his sleep, a name I didn't recognize. He never remembered in the morning, or at least he pretended not to. When I got older, I asked my mother about it. She gave a tired smile, shook her head, and said, "Your father carries things he's never put down." I didn't know what she meant at the time. I do now. It wasn't just the war he never spoke of, it was the silence around it, the way it followed him like a shadow into every job, every holiday, every dinner table conversation. My friends had dads who told stories about the army, about buddies they'd lost, about lessons they learned. Not my father. His service was a sealed box, tucked away in some dark corner of the attic of his life. But he was there. I knew that. I'd seen the records once, accidentally, when sorting through paperwork with my mom. 2 tours, combat infantry, honorable discharge, a single line in medical history, shell shock symptoms, recovered. That's what they called it back then. He recovered, they said, but no one asked how he recovered, or if he ever really did. Growing up, I thought his silence was part of who he was, like gray hair or rough hands. I thought it was normal for some men to carry secrets like bricks in their pockets. I didn't resent him for it. not really. But I did wonder. I wondered what he saw, what he did, what he lost. I wondered who that name belonged to, the one he whispered in his sleep. And I wondered what it would take for him to finally speak. I never imagined it would be a storm, a single night, a flash of lightning, and a silence finally broken, one syllable at a time. My father never talked about ghosts, but he lived like someone who saw them often. Not the kind that rattled chains or creaked through floorboards, but the kind that sat quietly in the corners of his eyes, shadows that flickered when he thought no one was looking, regrets that wrapped around his shoulders like an old, invisible coat.
He was a man of quiet rituals. Up by 5:30, coffee black, the same radio station every morning, AM news, just loud enough to hear, but not loud enough to listen. He packed his lunch the same way each day, right down to folding the napkin in half and tucking it beneath the sandwich. Nothing was ever out of place. Sometimes I thought maybe he kept the world in order because something inside him wasn't. There were things he never did. He never lit fireworks on the 4th of July, never watched war movies, never mentioned his time overseas when someone brought up Vietnam or Korea or any of the other names whispered by men in barbershops and VFW halls. He didn't talk about guns or medals or honor. He just got quieter. When I was in high school, I brought home a history book once. It had a photo on the cover, soldiers in a jungle, faces smudged with sweat and ash. My father saw it from across the room and turned away. Didn't say a word. That night, he didn't come to the dinner table. I didn't connect the two events until years later. He never taught me how to fight, never taught me how to shoot, but he taught me how to build a fire, how to change a tire, how to shake hands and look a man in the eye. He taught me how to sit in silence without needing to fill it. He taught me how to carry things without letting them fall apart. I remember one night I was 16 and I stayed out late. He was sitting in the dark when I got home, the porch light off, his face lit only by the cherry red tip of a cigarette, a habit I never saw before or after that night. He didn't yell, didn't ask where I'd been, just said, "Some nights, when you're alone too long, the quiet starts talking back." I never forgot that line. He carried himself with a kind of stillness that others mistook for strength. I know I did. But now I think it was armor, worn so long it became skin. And underneath it, maybe there was someone softer, someone afraid, someone who didn't want to remember, but couldn't forget. There were small clues now that I look back. He flinched at loud noises, especially sudden ones, hated thunderstorms, slept with the window closed even in summer. He always sat facing the door at restaurants, always scanned the exits like muscle memory from a life I never lived. He had friends, but none from those days. The few who might have known him then had disappeared, lost to time or distance or maybe the same silence that swallowed him. Once I saw him staring out the window during a rainstorm. I thought he was lost in thought, but when I called his name, he blinked like someone waking up from a long, uneasy sleep. He turned to me and said something strange. "You know the worst part about war? It teaches you how to leave parts of yourself behind and then expects you to live like nothing's missing." I didn't know what to say. I was just 17. I nodded. He nodded back, and that was the end of it. But it stayed with me, like so many of his words, few but heavy. And so I grew up with a father I loved deeply but didn't fully know. A man made of silence and service, stitched together with quiet pain. He never asked for pity, never asked for praise. He just kept going. Until that one rainy night, when the power went out, when the house grew dark, and when, for the first time in my life, my father didn't look away. It began as a quiet evening, the kind we'd had hundreds of times before. I was visiting him for the weekend. Mom had passed a few years earlier, and I made it a point to come by more often. We'd talk over simple dinners, fall asleep to reruns of old westerns, and pretend everything was just as it always had been. That night, the sky darkened early. Thick clouds rolled in before sunset, and by 7, the storm had arrived. Heavy rain beat against the windows. Wind howled through the trees like a voice trying to be heard. The power flickered once, then again, and then it was gone. The television cut out. The room dimmed. Silence settled in, interrupted only by the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional groan of thunder in the distance. We lit candles. My father retrieved an old kerosene lantern from the garage. He set it between us on the table, its glow soft and amber, like memory itself. He looked older in that light, the lines on his face more visible, the gray in his beard more complete. He seemed smaller than I remembered, fragile even. But his eyes, those remained sharp, watchful, like he was still guarding something. We sat for a while, listening to the rain. He sipped his tea, I nursed a beer. Then out of nowhere he said, "This storm reminds me of one I heard in the jungle 40-some years ago." I turned to him. He didn't look at me. He was still watching the window, though there was nothing to see but darkness.
He spoke again. We'd been out for 4 days. No sleep, no cover. The rain came down so hard it felt like needles. You couldn't hear anything but water and your own heartbeat. I didn't say a word. I didn't want to break whatever fragile thread had just been pulled loose. He continued, his voice low, like a confession. We were moving through tall grass, mud up to our knees. One of the guys, Wilson, he was 20, red hair, freckles all over. He slipped on a rock, made some noise. That's all it took. He paused, swallowed hard, blinked. They opened fire from the trees. I couldn't see a thing. Just flashes, screams. Wilson went down first, then 2 more. I hit the ground, my rifle jammed. I remember thinking, so this is how it ends. Not a flag, not a speech, just mud and rain and noise. He rubbed his hands together like he was trying to warm them, but it wasn't cold. I made it out, barely. We lost 5 men that night. I remember crawling back with blood on my hands, and I didn't even know whose it was. He looked up at me then, eyes glistening. You know what they told us the next day? Good job holding the line. That's what they called it, holding the line. We sat in silence. Even the storm seemed to quiet down for a moment. He chuckled softly, but it wasn't humor. After I came home, people wanted to hear stories. They wanted glory, drama, medals. But all I had were ghosts. I nodded, gently. Is that why you never talked about it? He looked at me, fully,
like a man surfacing after years underwater. I didn't talk about it, because I didn't want it to be real. Talking makes it real, makes it something that can be measured, categorized, judged. But what I carried, it didn't fit into words. It still doesn't. The rain hit the window harder again, as if to prove his point. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering lantern. Wilson had a photo of his girl tucked into his helmet. He used to read her letters out loud, said she smelled of cinnamon and mint. I can still hear his voice. He tapped his temple. They never leave. Not really. You just learn to live around the silence they left behind. We sat there for a long time. Him and me, and the storm outside. I didn't ask questions. I didn't interrupt. For the first time in my life, he wasn't the strong, silent father who patched walls and paid bills and carried secrets like they were bricks. He was just a man who survived something that didn't stop when the bullets did. And on that night, lit only by memory and rain, he began to tell me the rest. The rain softened as the night deepened, but my father's voice didn't. He kept talking, not in a rush, not in a flood, but in careful, deliberate words, like he was walking barefoot across broken glass. Every sentence seemed to cost him something. Every pause felt like he was staring into a place only he could see. He said, "People think war ends when the fighting stops, but the war keeps going. In your mind, in your bones, in the way you flinch when someone drops a plate." He took a breath, held it, let it go slowly. I used to dream about the jungle. Not the gunfire, not the blood, just the waiting. The silence before. That was the part that broke you. The not knowing. You don't know what it's like to be 19 and carry a letter in your pocket, already signed and stamped just in case they had to send your body home. You don't know what it's like to write a goodbye you hope no one ever reads. I didn't. I knew I didn't. He stood up slowly and walked to the cabinet in the hallway. I watched as he reached for something on the top shelf, a box I'd never seen before. A small metal tin dented at the corners, paint scratched from years of handling. He set it down between us. Inside were a few photos, a dog tag, a yellowing letter folded in thirds, a black ribbon tied around a lock of hair. He didn't explain each item. He didn't have to. He lifted the letter and unfolded it, then passed it to me. "Dear Mom and Dad, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong. I want you to know I wasn't scared when it happened. I was proud to serve, proud to be with my brothers out here. Tell Maggie I'm sorry I missed her birthday. Tell Tommy to finish school. He's smarter than I ever was. And don't be sad for me. I went down fighting for something I believed in. That's more than most people get. Love, Bobby." The handwriting was messy, but strong. My throat tightened as I read it. "That was Wilson's," my father said softly. "They asked me to collect his things, and that letter was in his boot. He never mailed it."
"I couldn't throw it away," he added, "but I couldn't deliver it either. I didn't know how to look a mother in the eye and say, 'Your son died screaming.' So I kept it." He tapped the tin gently. "I've kept too much." There was a weight in his eyes that no years could lighten, a burden so old it had turned to muscle memory. "The worst part wasn't what I saw," he said, barely above a whisper. "It was what I came home with."
I waited. I came home with silence, with a wife who didn't know how to ask, and kids who didn't know what I'd lost. I came home and became a man who couldn't sleep, who paced the kitchen at 3 a.m. and blamed it on coffee. He looked down at his hands. You grew up thinking I was strong, but the truth is, I was just surviving. Every day, every damn day. He looked at me, tears catching in the candlelight. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to carry any of it. But I see now maybe I should have. Maybe it wasn't fair, locking it all inside. I reached across the table, placed my hand over his. His skin was thin, but warm. Still here. You're telling me now, I said quietly. He nodded. Yep, I guess I am. The storm outside had slowed to a soft drizzle. The lantern flickered once, twice, and held. In that small glow, surrounded by memory and grief and years of unspoken truths, my father looked lighter. Not free, not healed, but unburdened, if only slightly. And for the first time in my life, I saw him, not as my father, but as a man who had been through hell, and chose, after decades of silence, to finally let someone in. I woke up to the smell of bacon and the sound of rain, just a soft mist now, not the pounding storm from the night before. The house felt changed somehow, not in a dramatic way. Nothing had moved, the same old creaks in the floorboards, the same hum of the fridge, the same clock ticking above the stove, but something beneath it all was different. My father was standing at the stove in his robe, flipping bacon with the same old calm I'd seen my whole life, but there was something else there too, a looseness in his shoulders, a stillness in his breathing, like something heavy had finally shifted from one side of the scale to the other. He turned and nodded at me. Coffee's hot. I poured a cup and sat across from him at the table, just like the night before, only now in daylight. Neither of us mentioned what he'd said, or the box he'd opened, or the tears that slipped down his face in the glow of the lantern, but we didn't have to. He slid over a plate, 2 eggs, toast, bacon. I thanked him. He didn't say you're welcome. He didn't need to. We ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't the old silence, not the kind that held things back. This one was more like a shared breath, a quiet agreement that what was said had been enough. After breakfast, he stood up, stretched, and walked to the living room window. He stared outside for a while. I joined him. The rain had almost stopped. The grass was slick with silver. Birds flitted from one branch to another, shaking off the water, starting over like nothing had happened. You know, he said, voice low, the hardest part wasn't surviving the war. It was learning how to live afterward. That's the part they don't teach you. I nodded. And you did. Did I? He asked it like he wasn't sure, like it only just occurred to him to wonder. I think you did the best you could, and I think maybe now you can do better. He looked at me, and for the first time there was a glint of something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not quite hope, but not despair either. Maybe acceptance. He walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out a small wooden frame I hadn't noticed before. It held a black and white photo of 5 young men in uniform. Arms slung around each other, mud on their faces, smiles too wide for the setting. He handed it to me. That's Wilson, he he said, pointing to the redhead in the middle. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. He took the photo back, stared at it for a long time, then placed it by the radio, where it hadn't sat for years. "I think it's time they were remembered,"
he said. I left later that morning, driving slowly through the wet streets. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. I just drove, replaying every word he'd said the night before. And when I got home, I wrote it all down. Every detail, every pause, every flicker of light and shadow in his voice. Because I knew someday someone would need to understand the kind of silence that men like my father carried, and the kind of night it took to finally let it go. Time moved on, as it always does. The seasons changed. My father grew older. His hands trembled more when he held his coffee, and he started calling me a little earlier in the evenings, not to say anything urgent, just to talk about the garden, the neighbor's cat, a new birdhouse he was building. But every now and then, quietly, he would tell me a piece of the war. Never in a grand, sweeping monologue. That wasn't his way. It would come tucked between other things, like how the sound of certain helicopters still made his chest tighten, or how the taste of instant coffee brought him right back to the jungle. Sometimes he'd mention a name, someone long gone, and then go quiet for a minute, as if he was waiting for their voice to answer back. We never went back to that rainy night exactly, but we didn't have to. That one storm had already changed everything. I began to understand that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's a shield. Sometimes it's a cage. And sometimes it's just the only way a person knows how to keep living. My father was never weak for keeping his pain to himself, but I came to believe he was stronger when he finally let it out. And here's what I've learned, long after the lantern went out and the storm passed. There are wars that never make the news. Quiet wars. The kind fought in bedrooms at 2 a.m., the kind that live in the pauses between sentences, the kind carried in old photos, in folded letters never sent, in dreams too painful to speak aloud. Men like my father, they don't seek medals. They don't ask to be remembered. But they need to be, because behind their silence are stories we need to hear, not just about war, but about survival, about what it costs to keep going, about what it means to love a family so much that you carry your own ghosts just to keep the house quiet. And if we're lucky, if we sit beside them long enough through the storms and the dark and the decades of unspoken pain, they might finally tell us. And when they do, it's not just a story. It's a passing of something sacred, a quiet, trembling wisdom, elderly wisdom, not found in textbooks, not taught in schools, but etched into their eyes, worn into their hands, and, if we're listening, whispered in the spaces between the rain. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please help us share it. Leave a comment with one if you watched or listened to the full story. Share this video with someone whose father never spoke much, but always carried everything. Subscribe to Elderly Wisdom Glow for more true stories that speak to the heart. We see you, we appreciate you, and your story matters too.